Welcome to the webinar series for National Archaeology Week 2026. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and First Peoples community of Australia, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have lived and practiced their culture for many thousands of years. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants, who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. Today we're very lucky to have a couple of experts presenting, archaeologists, archaeological educators and co-chairs of Australian National Committee for Archaeology Teaching and Learning, and that's Georgia Williams and Dr. Georgia Stannard, and they will be presenting Digging Deeper using simulated excavations to transform learning. So I'd like to invite Georgia Stannard to start the presentation, and Georgia Williams will be joining us during the presentation. Thank you, Georgia.
Thanks very much, Caroline. It's lovely to be here for another fabulous National Archaeology Week in 2026. So thanks everyone for joining us today. It's great to be here with you. I'm joining today from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people here near Naarm in Victoria, and Georgia is joining us from Queensland as well. So let's make a start then. Okay, so we want to start thinking about when we're doing simulated excavations as a way of communicating archaeology to either the public, to our students at a primary or secondary level, or to tertiary students, which is where I intersect with simulated excavations. We want to start thinking about who is archaeology really for, and why do we find that this is a really good medium for us to communicate the concepts and approaches of archaeology. So bottom lining, archaeology is really for everyone. When we're thinking about who is best suited to intersect with this medium, future professionals, absolutely, particularly university students who have enrolled in perhaps a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Archaeology and are planning on going into the profession or are just interested in the discipline itself. Simulated excavations provide a really effective way of training that cohort to enter our profession in the methods, the ethics and the approaches that we need to do for archaeological investigations. We're also seeing that primary and secondary school students are another really great cohort that this particular system of simulated excavations articulates in with really well. And we're going to look at some of the pedagogical frameworks around how that works as part of this presentation. And then we also have a really good intersection with the general public for simulated excavations. With less than 1% of our Australian historical story being captured in written historical records, it's really important that archaeology is informing us as Australian citizens about the deep time history of our national story, which goes back at least 65,000 years. And archaeology is a really important proxy in telling that story. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in this presentation thinking about why we should use simulated excavations. And there are two main cohorts that we're going to focus on in this presentation. The first of those is primary and secondary students, and the second is tertiary students, so students at university. And there is considerable overlap between why we find that simulated excavations, whether they be desktop excavations or permanent or semi-permanent physical structures on your school or university campus, are really good for these two cohorts. And we're going to focus on those. It's really engaging. It focuses on active learning and embeds critical thinking approaches to not only the methodologies that students are using, but also in terms of the interpretation. It involves thinking about ethics and ethical methodologies, and also really fosters intercultural capabilities as well. And some of these, if you're joining us today or later online through the recording, you'll notice that a lot of these also crop up in the Australian curriculum And a lot of these are also articulating in with university general capability statements. So there's lots of real value for simulated excavations. It's also, when we're designing our simulated excavations, really important to think about what are they not doing. So simulated excavations provide a mechanism by which our students can learn the processes and techniques and refine that skills and knowledge outside of having to work on real sites in the real world. Archaeology is a destructive science by its nature, and that means that through this process, students are able to develop these skills and techniques without needing to impact sites that have heritage significance. So this is a much more effective means of training students than taking them out first go round into the real world. We also want to think about that archaeology is not just about excavations. There's a whole process involved in archaeological investigations, from desktop research through to surveys, testing, excavations, analysis, and then finally interpretation. So what we're going to look at today in some of these case studies is thinking about how these simulated excavations can be designed to replicate not just the excavation itself, but the entire archaeological process, from desktop research, background research, through to analysis and interpretation at the other end. Okay, and we also are going to be discussing how archaeology draws upon lots of different knowledge frameworks. We're not just restricted to the physical material culture of the excavation results, the artifacts, the ecofacts, or the sediment samples, or the dating that we recover from the sites that we excavate. But there are all these other different frameworks that sit alongside and within broader archaeological investigations, of which excavations are just a small component. So this is also something that we want to be highlighting to our students, whether they're in primary, secondary, or tertiary frameworks, so that we don't keep getting shoehorned in with popular media stereotypes like Indiana Jones. So we want to be situating archaeology today inside that best practice framework. All right. So Georgia and I wanted to take you through a little bit about some of the pedagogy and the andragogy around simulated excavations. And this means that we're going to situate our 3 case studies that we're going to take you through towards the end of this presentation within this pedagogical and andragogical literature, making those connections really explicit about what is driving those teaching and learning frameworks, and then seeing how we can embed those frameworks within the desktop or physical simulated excavations that we're going to talk to you about. So I wanted to start with a bit of a discussion about the difference between pedagogy and andragogy. Pedagogy is simply the means of the theories and the practice of teaching. Andragogy is something that we wanted to pull out specifically for those of you who might be teaching at a university level or intersecting with adult learners. So andragogy is a specific branch of pedagogy that thinks about how adults learn specifically. And this is really important because our students at university are not children. They're not learning in the same way that students in primary and secondary contexts would learn. And so when we're designing simulated excavations for university students or for public outreach and engagement, and we have clear learning outcomes for each of those, we need to be thinking about these frameworks quite explicitly. So I'm going to take you through in this first section some of these andragogical principles and look at how some of these theoretical backgrounds intersect with our archaeological simulations. This first one we're looking at is experiential learning theory. So this learning by doing. And this is the most fundamental idea behind simulated excavations. You learn to excavate by excavating. And this is captured in what educational theorist David Kolb called experiential learning theory, which itself built on the earlier ideas of the philosopher John Dewey. So the core argument is that knowledge is not passively received from a lecturer, but it's actively constructed through experience. So Kolb proposed a 4-stage cycle that you first have a concrete experience. So in our case, you dig something. You then reflect on what happened. So why did that soil change color? What does that mean in terms of the site formation processes? You then form abstract concepts. So the color change indicates a different occupation layer, perhaps. And then you experiment actively by applying that understanding in the next trench or context that you excavate. So this tacking between theory and data, the applying of interpretive frameworks to observations and critically assessing them, makes students better problem solvers because they become keenly aware of how easily their preconceived notions can lead them astray. So learning mindfully also maintains the link between knowledge and self-development that classroom-based instruction can hide. Now, simulated excavations are specifically designed to trigger this cycle in a repeatable, low-stakes way. A student can make a mistake. They might dig too fast. They might miss a context boundary, or they might mislabel a find. And they can learn from it without destroying an irreplaceable heritage site, which, as we discussed before, is really important. The second one we want to talk about is how it's safe to fail. We want to be thinking about how simulated based learning environments means that it's all right to get things wrong. And from me, when I teach my students, I expect them to make mistakes and that it's in a safe environment for them to do that. In contrast to simulations, when real archaeological sites are destroyed in the process of being excavated, that act of excavation is irreversible. We can never put the sites back to how they were previously. And this means that errors made on a real site by an untrained student have these permanent consequences, both for the heritage record and for the student's professional standing. So simulations provide these safe opportunities for novices to undertake complex tasks, to make those mistakes, and to develop professional skills without exposing themselves or people or equipment to any harm. Now, these benefits are partly due to the feedback mechanisms that are commonly embedded in simulations, which enable the learners to identify and bridge the gaps between current and aspiring competence. The third one that we're going to look at is problem-based learning. So simulated excavations are most effective when they're structured not as a simple skill drill, so here's a trowel and how you hold it, but also as genuine problems to be solved. And this approach is called problem-based learning, and something that I use a lot in my own teaching practice. So simulation-based learning has 4 major instructional features. Using simulated environments to create a realistic and relevant context. Exposing learners to significant contextual characteristics that reflect the professional field. Interacting with different stakeholders and creating collaborative environments. So in an archaeological simulation, the problem might be something like, what's happened at this site? How many occupation phases are present? Who left this material and when? Students are not told the answers. They have to excavate, record, analyse, and interpret their way to a conclusion. And this mirrors the intellectual demands of professional archaeology. And it means the simulated excavation teaches thinking as much as it teaches technique, which is really important from an andragogical perspective, because students can see direct relevance between this experience and their future careers. Another one that we're going to look at is situating learning and becoming a professional. And this lens is one of the most powerful ideas in educational theory for understanding why simulated excavations work. And situated learning was developed by Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger in 1991. And it situates itself around this idea of we're not just acquiring information, but we're becoming part of a community of practice. So learning, just managed to skip ahead. There we are. So learning to be an archaeologist is not just about mastering a set of skills. It's about starting to think, to act, to talk, and to make decisions like an archaeologist. A simulated excavation puts students inside the social world of archaeological practice. They use the same tools, the same recording systems, the same vocabulary, and work through the same kinds of decisions as professional archaeologists. And this is why it matters that a simulation is realistic. A shallow or an inauthentic version of archaeological practice does not initiate students into the real community. It teaches the wrong habits and the wrong ways of thinking. And that's obviously something that we want to avoid. Okay, so on top of these, as we discussed earlier, there's overlap between tertiary and primary and secondary students in terms of their teaching and learning frameworks. There's two others that I wanted to highlight for you in this presentation, and these specifically link into primary and secondary students. So the first one we're going to look at is historical thinking and around evidence, significance, and interpretation. And for those of you who are coming to this presentation who already teach into the Australian curriculum, you will be very familiar with the idea of historical thinking and some of these frameworks that have been discussed within it. So this is the most widely used framework for understanding what secondary school history education should achieve within this historical thinking framework. And there's usually 6 lenses that we identify. And this has come from Peter Zexius's work from Canada. And we see this all the way through the Australian curriculum. So thinking about establishing historical significance, about using evidence, about identifying continuity and change, analysing cause and consequence, or cause and effect, taking on historical perspectives, and understanding the ethical dimension of history. Now, a simulated excavation engages most of these directly. When students uncover an object, they must ask themselves, is this significant? What does this object tell me? Who made it and why? What does its presence in this layer, and not the other one, mean? So this is not passive history learning. It's the practice of historical reasoning. Most importantly, simulated excavation makes the concept of evidence concrete and physical in a way that no textbook can. History is interpretation based on inferences from primary sources. So when we're working with primary source evidence, we need to pay attention to the source, the context of the source, and the questions with which we approach the source. So an artifact recovered from a particular chronological context is a primary source in its fullest sense. Its meaning is determined not just by what it is, but by where it was found, what it was found with, and how we interpret that context. And students who have experienced this process of understanding that they understand themselves that history is not a fixed story, but a set of reasoned conclusions built from incomplete evidence. The last one we're going to look at before we jump into some really interesting case studies is around motivation, engagement, and the power of discovery. And I know that all of us who teach in a classroom would like to have greater motivation in our students, and this is one of the ways that we could approach that. So underlying all of the frameworks that we've already talked about is a pretty straightforward psychological reality that discovery is intrinsically motivating. Adolescents who feel ownership over their learning and who are genuinely curious about what they find and who feel that their interpretations matter engage far more deeply and retain more of what they learn. Simulated desktop or permanent excavations focus the learner's attention on the actual evidence of history and culture, and then engages them in an interactive exploration of that evidence. This approach encourages learners to move from idea to action, from understanding the historical environment to protecting it. Our research on school programs consistently finds that the personal, physical dimension of simulated excavations, that sense of being a detective, of uncovering something real, produces a level of engagement that passive instruction rarely achieves. Students who might disengage from a lecture about ancient Australia become invested when they are holding a 3D print of an artifact and being asked what it tells them. That engagement is not a nice extra. It's the condition under which deeper learning can occur. So all of this gives us the framework to then look at a series of case studies that exist right now in the real world that Georgia and I have both worked on over the years that we would like to share with you. So thinking about all of this, we're going to start at the most sort of the bottom end of the scale in terms of time and energy investment. And this one is going to focus on a desktop excavation. So this means there's no requirements to build any big structures on your campus. You don't need to have, to convert the preppy sandpit into an archaeological excavation. This example is going to take us through how we can bring in these ideas around simulated excavations into your existing classroom with very little infrastructure. So the first program that we're going to look at is one that I've developed with a group of really lovely co-authors over the last few years. We were all part of the Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. And this project brought together researchers who specialised in both archaeology and paleoecology. So all that, the history of people and the history of country. And together we converted all of that really complex science information into something that was very accessible for primary and secondary students. So the desktop excavation for this program focuses on 3D printed artifacts and ecofacts, and then also pollen grains that reflect different stages of a general national historical story, starting with the last ice age during the late Pleistocene period, about 30,000 years ago in our simulation, right the way through to a modern context at the top of our site. The idea behind the layout of the 4 different contextual boxes is that they can be specialised for anywhere in Australia using different artefact printouts and animal bones. So ecofact printouts and also the pollen grains, and all of those are then provided as part of the resource. And these can be specialised depending on where you are by switching out some of those ecofacts and pollen grains to better suit your local landscape. So each of the boxes represents a different time period, ranging from, as I say, the late Pleistocene at the bottom, through the Holocene and that transition into the warmer periods that we're in now, right the way through to that modern schoolyard out the front door of the classroom at the very top of the site. So there's 4 kind of different components to the program. There's the first up, the simulated desktop excavation, which we collaborated with the Anawan community and Uncle Les Ahoy from the New England Tablelands in New South Wales. And we wanted to 3D print some real Anawan artifacts, and they have been we have been given permission by the Anouan community to use those objects, which were originally 3D scanned for the purposes of education. So this is a really exciting way of not only bringing in real objects, but then also the students have the option to jump onto the Museum of Stone Tools and see the 3D scans themselves, to zoom right into those objects and to manipulate them in that 3D virtual space, and to get really up close and personal with these objects that then have an Anouan cultural lens applied to them through the program. So here's some examples of the excavation boxes in use by some of our lovely colleagues at Kaba who are testing out our boxes before we launch them. And you can see people are doing a simulated excavation and the different scales of the boxes that you can use. It could be anything from a small shoebox that you might bring in through to these larger boxes that I've been getting from the reject shop. And it just then depends on sort of the scale of what you want to include, the size of your class that you are trying to cater for, and your budget. And you can also then see some of our colleagues then looking up the objects that they've then found in the box, which is our next step in the program. So the second phase of the program is then the research phase. We didn't just want students to be thinking about digging up history. We wanted them to be thinking about the whole process of excavation, of recovery, of then the analysis, and then finally the interpretation. So thinking about that whole range of things from the start to the end. So to help along with that process, we produced a research handbook that means that the students aren't just excavating on in the sandboxes on their tables, but they're also actively then taking the objects that they're finding, looking them up in the research handbook, and then that through that process is then transforming that knowledge about where each of those objects were seen within the chronology of the site, and then linking them in to the broader context of the climate and the environmental change that was going on that they might have been already starting to learn about in class. So it's connecting these two different phases of their learning. So here's an example of one of the pages from, 2 pages from the student research handbook. And you can see that these are the scans that we've taken stills from the 3D scans that are available on the Museum of Stone Tools website. We've been able to use these images with permission under a Creative Commons license. We've provided a really accessible language model for the students to then find their object, to then look it up in the book, and then to understand a little bit about what that object was used for, who might have been using it, and what it was made from and for. Now this, which we'll come back to later, but this information is also supported from a teaching perspective in the program. So it's not just asking teachers to overnight become experts in lithic technologies or faunal analysis. It's giving you as the teacher all of the foundational information that you would need to learn about, and then to the next day walk into the classroom and deliver a program like this to your students. So we've been finding a really important part of developing these kinds of simulated excavations is to be able to scaffold not only the student learning, but also the learning for our education colleagues as well. So the third part of this program is then about the worksheets, the evidence logs, the analysis forms, and then the reporting. Now, all archaeologists know that this is probably the most onerous part of what we do, and I certainly find when I teach my students, this is the part of their simulated excavation that they hate the most, filling in all the paperwork. But this is what separates us as archaeologists from looters. And it's a really important cognitive pathway to build in for our students to learn that's not just about recovering objects. It's then about thinking about what do they mean? When are they from? Where are they from? Putting them into that context at a local, regional, and then global scale. So for that, we've developed these different logs and reporting forms that you can have a look at in just a sec. So here's an example of our excavation evidence log. We deliberately provided a really clear framework for students to fill it in. There's really clear examples already written in there. It's quite straightforward in terms of splitting it out into artifacts and then ecofacts, and then we have a separate one for the pollen grains. And then when we then move on to the final report, that is very then easily translatable into basic graphs and things. And we have provided the templates for that as part of the program. Now, these evidence logs and recording forms are really good as formative assessments that you can use as part of your teaching practice if you would like to include this as an assessment. And the final report is also really great as a summative assessment task because it asks students to pull together not only their evidence log, but then also the data analysis, where they're translating that evidence log into critical thinking interpretations. And then from this stage, the data analysis, they then expand that out to not just think about their individual box, but what does the whole site tell us across space and time? What is that story that is preserved within the site? So it's quite a detailed model, but we've designed it to be scalable so that you can have a very structured example of this where you would lead your students through every step of the process. You can stop it at any point. So if you only wanted to do the data recording, you could stop there. If you wanted to stop after the data analysis section, you could stop there. Or you can take it all the way through to the final report. And your involvement or your letting the students be as independent as you would like them to can really be tailored to the cohort that you're teaching each year. And some students in some cohorts will need more support in some areas than others. Some you might like, if you have an extension group, you might like to let them have free rein and do some independent research and really use this as a first foray into a research project like we would do as in archaeological practice. Okay, and then the final component that we built into this program is a really fun series of 5 animated videos. And this is really to support both student and educator learning about some of those really foundational, basic foundational knowledge frameworks that they will need to understand the kinds of evidence that they're seeing in the investigation. So we cover quite a lot of content. We deliberately kept them short so you can play them as part of your work in class. They're not long. We cover things like how do scientists measure time? How do we understand how climate has changed? How do we understand how landscapes have changed through time? And then also, how do we understand how people and cultures have changed through time as well? And these are all really core foundational ideas that we're wanting our students to learn more about as part of the unit that this articulates in with. So I was talking just before about the teacher resource booklet, and this is a really detailed resource that we put together. We intended it to be a lot smaller than it ended up being, but we just wanted to end up having a resource that was effective and had everything in it that you needed to be able to understand the program and then to deliver it with confidence. So there's lots of different worked examples in the teacher resource book. We're not asking you to go out and do your own research to work out what the answers are. We've provided all of those worked examples for you. So all of the answers are provided, and then it's much easier then to implement that for your students. So we've been finding that this has been a really fun and engaging way for students to intersect with some of these physical objects, that tangible cultural heritage, and to bring ideas around how country and cultures have changed through time and how those different lenses are informing one another. It's then also to have the animal and cultural lens applied to this has been such a great opportunity to then go beyond the tangible cultural heritage and start thinking about that intangible cultural heritage as well, traditional knowledge, oral traditions, and all these different ways that through a braided knowledge approach, we can better understand the deep time Australian story. So it's really got lots of different pedagogical frameworks built into it. And obviously, there's lots of experiential and object-based pedagogies, but it's also really narrative-driven with those kinesthetic activities in it. And I have personally found that narrative, narrational archaeological approach, or that narrative-driven pedagogy, is so effective in engaging younger students, but also older students as well for me at university. It takes things like history and archaeology out of textbooks and means that students are able to empathetically engage not only with the content, but then with the people and places that you're discussing as part of that project. So it's all really exciting. So the next case study that we are going to talk to you about today is a permanent simulation that Georgia Williams has been involved with developing in Queensland. And I'll pass over to Georgia to speak to you all about that project.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Georgia. Apologies for being a little bit late. My name is Georgia as well. I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology, and I've been working in the industry for about 4 years, and then I made the switch to do teaching. I just came home from school this afternoon, but I want to be talking about this wonderful project that I was very, very privileged to be a part of a few years ago. And a quick shout out to Dr. Serena Love, who was my boss at the time when we were doing this. Simulated excavation, and she's the one who ultimately oversaw this project and gave me this opportunity to be a part of this. And this was probably my first experience with archaeology education, so that kind of put me down the role I'm on now. So huge shout out to her. But this experience here, the company that I used to work for was hired by a inner city Brisbane private school to kind of create and design a permanent simulated excavation for their Year 10 Ancient and Medieval Studies class, and they were having an introductory to archaeology unit in their term 1. And so the design had to go across around like an 8-week unit, and they obviously called it the TARDIS, the Teaching Archaeological Research Design in Simulation. One of the teachers had done their PhD through University of Queensland, and obviously kind of molded it off the TARDIS, which was at UQ at the time, which they've now had to change their name for some copyright reasons. But alas, the school wanted to keep it because they thought the kind of the Doctor Who element would be quite interesting. And what they were able to do was that they kind of sold it to the students as somewhere in the school garden, there is kind of a bit of a portal that can access anywhere through time, anywhere across the world. And so this is another example from a wonderful paper by Nichols, Pragnell and Haslam, but it's just showing that these type of simulated permanent excavations can take any real form that the school would like them to take. Obviously, this one has a lot more layers than the one that I was a part of. It had about 5 layers, but it really is at the limit to your imagination and anywhere on the school's site that you have available with time. And so what we were able to do is that we had to develop some research guides for each of the layers. It was more for the teachers at the time, because like Georgia was saying, it's important to give the students a sense of ownership over the learning, and we weren't just telling them, oh, now you're at the Neolithic layer. We kind of left it purposely mysterious for them that they had to actually take stock of the artifacts they were finding in comparison to the other layers to determine actually what period of time were they learning about. So we had research guides mainly for the teachers, and then we had a whole suite of recording forms for excavating and artifacts, and obviously instructions for each group, because we'd have a team of students excavating, a team of students sieving, recording, taking photographs, and kind of taking ownership of each of those roles at the time. And then we also what I really loved is we created a modified archaeology skills passport based on the Anketal skills passport that they have for tertiary students. And it was very wonderful because they had to come and see me at least once every week and get ticked off that they knew how to excavate and knew how to sieve, and they weren't just kind of digging deep holes into the ground. They were actually kind of showing me a little bit of technique, and they were recording nicely and taking photos. And also we put a nice little option that they had to show me that they could clean up after themselves, because we noticed after the first few times they just kind of chuck everything aside when the bell rang. So it's important, I guess, to kind of put that in there, and that ended up being part of their assessment as well, to kind of show they were competent at those skills. But if we're thinking of doing this at our school, obviously the limit is your imagination, and I guess your logistical constraints with your school and potentially your budget. But key features that you might want to think about is a tamper, which my lovely colleague over here is demonstrating. So that's just kind of packs all the sand in. We've obviously got clipboards for the children, garden sieves, which are very cheap at Bunnings, trowels, gloves, obviously, if they're going to be handling different types of things, lots and lots of sample bags, label cards, which can just be either blank sheets of card there, or you can kind of get fancy and create your own ones on Word and kind of laminate them. And obviously lots of storage containers or boxes to store everything between classes and across the school year as well, when you've obviously got to think about when the site will not be in use, which is very, very important. But overall, the excavation took between 4 and 6 weeks, and I ran it across 3 different years, and each cohort was definitely quite different. You've got different people who either take to it quite naturally or need a little bit more learning, but it's just a very awesome opportunity, and we can kind of scale it up or down, as Georgia was saying, compared to the different classes we were at. And if they needed a little bit more extension, we had like a bit of a research group who had their laptops out there and were kind of Googling away at the different artifacts we were finding. But it obviously is important to try and keep those groups of students between 4 and 6. Any more, you just had your kind of smaller groups break off and kind of not be productive. So between the 4 and 6 students, we found to be ideal. But obviously otherwise, if you have some other students who you think might need extending, you can create other tasks for them, as I was just saying. And ultimately their assessments, we had lots of different site reports, which was really lovely. And my favorite thing I saw them do was that they had to pick either their favorite artifact or time period, and then create a whole research investigation around that, including creating their own sub-inquiry questions and kind of doing that. And a lot of them got very, very interested in that, which was lovely to see. But overall, what I thought might be useful to discuss is just a few logistical considerations before we move on to the next case study. Ultimately, the design and the construction will be up to you and your school. The school that I was working at had very limited space, so it ended up being 2 1 meter by 1 meter pits. That paper that I mentioned at the start of when I was speaking, that was about a 2 meter by 2 meter pit. Obviously, if you have more space, I recommend you use it. And obviously, depth, we only had about 2 meters or less, so it wasn't very deep. But if you have a larger space, you can obviously go across rather than down. Just lots of things to think about. Pests as well. Try not to put anything organic in there, because I made the mistake of doing that a few years, and it doesn't smell very nice, and there's a few creepy crawlies that hop around. So definitely try and think about that. Different types of artifacts as well. You'll see on the top here, we got some 3D printed like ancient Egyptian artifacts, obviously, that the school was able to provide us. Nice funky red color, but obviously just thinking of all the different things you can look out for. I went to lots and lots of op shops, and we kind of reached around to our contacts, but you could make it almost a school-wide activity and kind of put the call out for families who might have things they want to donate. And I've spoken to other people about actually getting it more of a whole school project as well, and having art classes make artifacts, and potentially have science or math classes be involved with more of the data analysis, and even more if we're thinking about the construction, manual arts faculties and their students potentially could be building this for your campus. So it doesn't have to be externally built or anything like that. It really doesn't have to be an expensive exercise if you think there is so many facilities and resources available at schools already that we can kind of all chip in and get this built if we need to. Very, very quickly, accessibility, obviously important to make sure all the students are able to access a site like this. Shade is very, very important for the Australian sun, but also if it is potentially raining as well, that your dig lessons won't get cancelled because of the rain. Sand, important to be getting kind of safe, kid-safe sand, either from like the Bunnings safe sand or another place like a landscape company where we can ensure everything's going to be kind of, they're not going to be exposed to anything. Obviously thinking of artifact storage between terms as well, where those things are going to go and making sure the students are helping you with that so that they understand the holistic process. That archaeology definitely isn't just the excavation, as Georgia has been saying, making sure they're understanding all the different pieces and bits of archaeology and the archaeological process. And then the last thing that I just jumped ahead and talked about was artifact procurement. But I know we've still got a bit to talk about, so I'll pass back to Georgia. But thank you so much.
That's great. Thanks very much. So the last case study that we're going to talk about is a scaled up version of this version that George has just been taking us through. So this is, I guess, the mega TARDIS version that we would use for a university cohort. And I'm going to take you through this one. So just in terms of a little bit about the context of the site within the subject that we teach, this excavation sits within our second year core subject in our Bachelor of Archaeology. It's designed using these problem-based learning pedagogies that we've talked about. It's designed to be a simulated consulting excavation. So the students are hired by me at the start of the semester. We go through all of our OH&S requirements and the project desktop excavation that I, as the lead archaeologist, have previously already done for them. And they need to read through and prepare for that when they then come out onto the site. We have 2 preliminary tutorials that takes them through some of the foundational ideas of how to use something like a Munsell soil colour chart, how to take pH tests in the field, and how to do sediment analysis to determine the different ratios of silt, sand and clay within our unit. We then have 4 weeks of excavations where each group of students is out for 1 day or across those 4 weeks, so 4 days in total. And then we follow that up with 3 tutorials afterwards that deal with the post-excavation analysis, the recording and displaying of data, either graphically and also with taking photographs. And then finally, they produce a report at the end. So coming back to our pedagogical models at the start, this is a really good example of how this process is then framed in these andragogical lenses to get the students thinking about this process, not just from an assignment that they have to do at uni, but as part of their future career preparedness. Okay, so this will whip through some of these. I don't want to make us run over time. Some of the design considerations that if you wanted to do something at this scale or something perhaps a little smaller at your school or university is to think about the design itself. We've just done an update to ours, has 2 meter wide by 7.5 meter long beds. Effectively like raised garden beds that the students, we rebuild the site every year and the students will then start excavating that. We need to make sure that the sediment types are sufficiently different so that they can differentiate them, being inexperienced excavators, quite easily as part of the excavation process. In terms of building, as Georgia was saying, tamping things down is really important. We add our fill, we add our artifacts, we then tamp the sediment down, and then we wet it in with a hose, and we repeat that until we've got 40 centimetres of site prepared. And then we leave it to bake over the summer, which is an important step. And it produces these beautiful sections that you can see here in the image. So it's a little bit like an archaeological lasagna, where we slowly build up all the different layers and then leave it to cook over the summer. And that wetting process within the sediments then evaporates out. And we end up with amazing site formation processes being simulated in part of the site. This is a post hole that we simulate, and you can see that the rootlets have actually come in from the surrounding gum trees and followed the different layers of compaction in between the simulated post hole fill and the sediment, compact sediment around it, and they're chasing that nutrient-rich charcoal of the burned post hole. If we've got linear charcoal features here. We also this year had some new features that some of our colleagues in the department have contributed their specialist knowledge to forming. We had a simulated shell midden down towards the river end. We have a moat on campus, so down towards the moat. And we also have different phases identified with the stone and the brickwork, so the students can start thinking about different phases of occupations. We also get them to do the whole process. It's not just about just digging things up. They need to survey in their artifacts. They need to sieve their finds. They need to do their sediment descriptions. And then at the end, they also are going to be doing site plans and stratigraphic sections as well. So it's a holistic process from woe to go. And then they're going to be using that information to then convert it into a simulated consulting report at the end. Logistics is something worth mentioning. So we're having a great time at La Trobe University with rapidly increasing student numbers, which is a lovely problem to have. But it does mean that we have to make sure that we have enough site for people to excavate, usually in teams of 2, but also that we're not having too many people on site that it becomes impractical for people to function on site, just as we would when we were designing how many people do we need to hire in the field to do a real consulting job. So that's something that is becoming an ongoing challenge for us. And we're going to be building an additional 3rd tier to our simulated archaeological site on campus for next year. The final point that I would like to finish on is the role of industry engagement. And this is something that we are developing with industry partners like Extent Heritage. And one of our former students, Erica Walter, has this year come out with some of her colleagues and has been actively involved in helping to teach the students not only just the skills involved in archaeological excavation, but also about bringing that industry lens to the students, reaffirming for them that it is not just an activity that we're assessing them against, but making that really explicit connection between what they're learning on the dig site and their future industry connections and their future profession.
Thank you both so much. I think we've nearly run out of time, so I just wanted to convey my thanks to you both for coming along and talking to us about this area, and 3 really great examples of case studies of how your work can be applied in different settings and for different age groups as well. So thank you. And also thank you to Fenella Atkinson, who's been providing some IT support in the background. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll wrap it up at that. Thank you.